Then There's California, a podcast featuring members of the California State Senate Democratic Caucus in conversation about their lives, their legislative priorities, policies, and other related issues that help make California exceptional. From the state capitol in Sacramento, I'm Brian Green. It has been said that baking bread is an inherently simple, satisfying personal act, a cathartic activity that makes us feel purposeful and productive, creating something from nothing. And witnessing the fruits, or grains, of bread baking labor is rewarding and comforting, while also reminding us metaphorically of the science and cadence of life. Mixing the flour can make us thoughtful of the sweep of human history. The kneading process can symbolize the slow accumulation of life and how, when you're baking a loaf, you're on the bread's time, not your time. And finally, the serving and sharing of bread helps us to celebrate optimism, to have a servant heart, and to be thankful. The life is bread and bread is life metaphors are many, memorable, and biblical. And I'm hoping for the purposes of the Senate podcast, maybe it's not too much of an allegorical reach even to say that the bread baking process is not unlike the legislative bill making process. What do you think? Well, on this edition of Then There's California, we will have a conversation with one of our state senators who manages a diverse and progressive legislative portfolio and who is also the upper house's resident and beloved bread baker. Dr. Susan Talamantes Eggman represents California's 5th Senate District, encompassing the northern part of the California Central Valley, including all of San Joaquin County, with a slice of Sacramento County to the north and a slice of Stanislaus County at the south, with the main transportation corridors of I-5 and Highway 99 flowing like arteries all the way through. Senator Eggman is one of our freshmen, but not really a freshman, lawmakers who have joined the Senate for this new legislative session. She was sworn into office in November, but here in 2021, she has hit the ground running on her 9th year in the California legislature, having served the past 8 years representing a good portion of the same district in the state assembly. And she also previously served on the Stockton City Council. Senator Eggman grew up in the Valley, joined the Army right out of high school, and became a medic. She has a bachelor's degree in psychology and a master's degree in social work, which helped set her on a career path as a mental health provider and social worker, which made her the ideal lawmaker to author and impact the legislature's landmark and controversial End-of-Life Option Act. And we hope to talk about all of that here in the body of this podcast. Senator Eggman also earned a Ph.D., was a college professor. She is a spouse, a partner, a mom, a beekeeper's helper, and a baker of bread, of course. And we are grateful to have her join us on this busy legislative day in person. It is a pleasure to have you with us here on Then There's California. Senator Eggman, welcome.
Thank you very much.
Well, welcome to the Senate. Here we are 4 or 5 months into your legislative session. How has the transition been from the green carpet of the Assembly to the Senate red carpet? How's that going so far?
So far, so good. I like it very much. I find half the amount of people in the body can create maybe half the amount of friction. I find it the going much more collaborative so far, deeper information sharing. You just have more time, I think, for process so far.
Absolutely. You're right. It is smaller, isn't it? And when you come from a house where there's 80 people, that smaller chamber even it takes some adjusting to. You are chair of the Senate Budget Subcommittee 3 on Health and Human Services. Are your leadership roles here in the Senate and your policy priorities in sync with the collective legislative agenda for you and your colleagues here in this year ahead?
Yes, I think so. My committee assignments are similar to what I had in the Assembly, but while I am a new senator, you're right, I am not a new legislator. During my 8 years in the Assembly, I never served on the Budget Committee. So I am very grateful that I am not a brand new legislator because it is a lot to learn. And just the legislative process, which now we're going into policy, but starting in January, we've been working on budget, and now we're taking another round at that. So the days are long, the information is varied, and comes at you quite quickly.
Well, I opened this podcast on, of course, the bread baking theme, because since January, in the Senate chamber and working with or observing your colleagues, I have heard so many wonderful compliments and exclamations about your gift of bread. Senator Lamone, who was on the last edition of this podcast, talked about coming back to the Capitol for the first time in the new year in March, and you welcomed her with a loaf of bread. Senators have shared on social media about receiving this deliciously aromatic loaf of bread from Senator Eggman. And I've seen members come to the floor and sitting at their desks as they walk in, there's this fresh loaf of bread and their eyes brighten like a kid at Christmas. So obviously bread by its nature is meant to be shared. But how does it feel to bake it and share it with friends and find that common ground?
Yeah, I love it. And one of the things that you didn't touch on in my introduction, which I don't think is written anywhere, that I also find myself gardening now. So the gardening world and the bread world, and like most of us, I think, when I reflect on my last year, it's been in my home and my yard for the most part. Since it was in March when I won the primary. That was the last real time we were all together.
Right.
And after that, we went into COVID and shutdown and dealt with everything that was going on. My wife has some serious health challenges, so I'm also a caregiver. And so during COVID, during an intense caregiving process, and we're all there in the house in the yard, I thought there was one more thing I needed to do to find a rhythm, I guess, to be able to cope with everything. I have always loved to cook. I come from a cooking family. Food is life. We do a lot of, you don't come to my home without, somebody feeding you, somebody sending you home with things. My family has a history in agriculture, beekeeping, honey, but we've never done baking sourdough bread. And so I just thought I was reading about it, and I just thought, well, I'll give it a try. So I grew my own culture. So I've got a Stockton culture. Wow. It is pretty diverse. I call it Victory Stockton culture. I live in the Victory Park neighborhood. And I started, and my first loaves, I called them my misfit loaves. And I started sharing them with friends. They'd find a loaf on their doorstep. And then after I got the hang of it, I just loved it. You have to feel it. You have to touch it. You have to smell it. And every loaf I bake takes me about 48 hours at least, from start to finish, because it's a process of fermentation. It's a process of coming back. It's a process of proofing that bread, letting it rise, and then if you can, control that rise a little bit so you can bake on the bread's time, but on your time as well.
So that phrase I talked about, it's not your time, it's the bread time, that rings true to you.
That rings so true for me. So I will say, like this morning, I was taking a loaf of buttermilk rye that is leavened with a banana, which is a Japanese method of leavening bread. Oh my gosh, that sounds fabulous. So I proofed that overnight. That is going into loaf pans this morning. This morning I started a leaven for another loaf I'll put together tonight. And I baked 2 loaves of bread this morning, one for a friend up here, and one for my little girl's principal, since she's back to school now.
That's
you
wonderful.
You can't go wrong giving the principal
you've opened up your own little side hustle, as we say, in the kitchen. So you've only been doing the bread since the pandemic and since our social distancing.
That is all.
But cooking, as you say, is in your DNA, and so it was an easy reach.
Cooking has been a big part of my life, but the baking of the bread has been different. And that's when I just thought, who doesn't like bread? And as we all struggle, I started taking it to women, especially women my age, who found themselves being caregivers, whether that was for an adult child, whether that was for a spouse that was ill. I would just start taking loaves of bread, oftentimes for people who do a lot, and, who doesn't like a fresh loaf of sourdough on their doorstep?
Absolutely. Seriously, I have heard the exclamations from the members. They hold it like a child, and it really, you've touched them. Now, do you do this by hand? Dare I say, are you a purist and you don't use a machine?
I do not use any machine. It is all by hand, and I do try to put, because I know who I'm baking for when I begin the loaves. And so I try to put positive intention in for the members or whoever I'm baking it for as well. And I also do, I'll do a garlic rosemary for my garden. I do a jalapeno cheddar. I do, like I said, a buttermilk rye. Right. I do a honey in the rye. I do a regular sourdough. I do a whole wheat sourdough. I do a lot of different types. So I try to tailor them to the people that I know I'm going to be giving them to as well.
Honey from the hives, I assume.
Honey from the hives, right? And I'd use a Roosteller ale. I do live in Roosteller district for beer, right. So honey in the rye. Yeah, we use a nice Roosteller ale with some Eggman honey.
That sounds fantastic. Well, I have read that bread is remarkably forgiving, and that it will bounce back from most anything you might do to it. So if you are amateur at this, to forgive yourself as the bread will forgive you and keep baking. Do you agree?
That is absolutely correct. So that culture I started last year, that is still going. That is what in some respects, when you say it's forgiving, I have an adolescent. I think of it as raising a child, too. It is forgiving. Every day you get to start fresh again.
That is a metaphor I had not thought about. Yeah. Well, are there any bread baking tips that are learned been, if you'll pardon the expression, leavened by your experience?
Trust the process.
Okay.
Trust the process, I would say. You know, I am not huge on following rules, but I will say in bread making, it is important to measure. I have a kitchen scale now that I use for that. I mean, you need to measure. Yeah, they say measure twice, cut once. So I would say that as well. And don't be afraid to share your mistakes. Everything is good if it's toasted with some butter on it.
And does it feel good to give the bread? I mean, in addition to making it and the satisfaction of it, is the loop closed in the sharing of it?
I think absolutely. I think when I make it, I am putting positive intentions, and when I give it to somebody and they receive it, and if you just look at, I mean, in social work and psychological theory will also tell you it's not just the act of receiving a gift, the act of giving a gift can be just as rewarding. So it's this whole reciprocal process, I think, that we engage in as human beings and crave at a deeper level. And I think if you can also impose something tactile like that it's warm and nurturing by its very nature, that it just adds, I think, to the human experience.
Thank you for sharing that. Not only making me hungry, but it's just a beautiful picture in the mind. So does my desperate metaphorical reach to connect bread making with the legislative process also ring true? Or, you know, the mixing of bill ideas, the kneading of bill language and amendments? So go with me here.
Absolutely. When I think I talked about just this morning in time, right, as I was putting loaf up from yesterday, as I was baking a loaf from the day before, as I was preparing a loaf that I'll prepare later. I was doing the same thing with bills, right? I was preparing for committee today. I was preparing for committee tomorrow. I was reading my talking points. I was texting with staff. So it is all that same part of that process, that it's not just one thing. Right. You have to be able to know in life, you have to go with the flow. You have to find your rhythm, go with that flow, and pay attention to details along the way.
And so as tactical and demanding as bread is, it's also a meditative process which allows you to take a few leaps mentally and start thinking about those other things.
It is. It is even a little break from family life. Right? When I say I have to go do my bread, people know I'll be gone a little while, and then I come back, which I think is also just good in life.
That's right. Let's talk about your life journey, a path that has led you to a career in healthcare and a focus on the human condition. You were born in the East Bay, if I'm not mistaken, but the Valley's really been your home for most of your life.
Yeah, I was born in Castro Valley. Mr. Bill Quirk in the Assembly represents that area. Bob Wajkowski in the Senate. I know the state of California now by who represents. By districts. And we moved when I was 13 out to the Valley. My dad had come from a family of a long line of beekeepers, and he had a fruit stand in Castro Valley. And my mom came from a family who had immigrated from Mexico. She had worked at the phone company. They got married. My dad, as he likes to say, was a muscle. My mom was a smarts. I grew up with a small family business. We had first a fruit stand and then a little farm out in Turlock. So we moved there. So the daughter of a beekeeper, you know, I quickly learned the value of hard working. I learned the value of keeping your word. I think one of the best lessons my parents ever taught me was life's not fair. Don't expect it to be. Do your best, be prepared, and treat everybody the way you'd like to be treated. That has served me well in life.
Well, you got out of high school, too, and you then right away you joined the Army and became a medic. Now, tell me about that arc of passage, and was that where then the desire for a career in healthcare and social work, did that start to germinate right at that point?
Yeah, moving to the Central Valley from the Bay Area in junior high was a rough transition for me. I'd always been pretty smart, but my mouth developed faster than my brain. And so I never quite got my feet all the way under me in high school. So I knew my parents had sacrificed for me, generations had sacrificed for me, that I needed to do better. And I knew the path I was on wasn't a path to anywhere. And I had a long history of public service and military service in my family. So I decided to join the Army, and I knew I wanted to work in psychology and in social work in some kind of healthcare field, but the path to do that was to go I went in as a combat medic. So it was a fantastic experience, and there, I like to think of my life in these segments, and every little segment I've learned something that I hope has helped me later, is I learned this thing called internal locus of control. That I did not need to respond every time there was an outside stimuli, because I found myself doing a lot of low crawling and push-ups. And I realized that was not the path to success. So I learned that you don't always need to respond in the moment. You can wait until later, until there is a more purposeful way to respond to some kind of outside adversity.
Talk about the passion that it created in you for the work you did for your career.
Yeah, people say, well, I could never do that. There's a lot of things people could or can't do. I have always felt at home in a hospital. And I also, and we can talk about that later, I've also had a lot of people ill in my life. So I know the power of compassion. I know the power of a kind face. I know the power of somebody being willing to listen and help. Because for the most part, when people are in the hospital, they are afraid. They are at a pivotal time in their life. And so to be able to impact somebody at that time, to be supportive, to be there with somebody on their journey, it's good work. It's just good work.
Let's talk about the 5th District that you represent. Like many of California's districts, it's a mixture of business and industry and higher education resources, a deep history of farming and agriculture, and essential workers who toil in both. A district actually that has changed a lot over the decades.
It has. Well, I think, so yes, you've described it accurately. We also have a port. It's also a port city.
Port of Stockton,
People don't remember that we are the largest inland port in the Western Hemisphere, with rice being one of our biggest exports. So it's a port city. We have a lot more diversity than some of the other, I think, Central Valley towns. We have a barely, like a 11% African American, over 43% Latino, a strong amount of API Asians. So it is a very diverse district. It has also have, like you said, have a strong agriculture and farming community. And now we have been impacted by, as housing prices in the Bay Area continue to increase, people continue to move out.
Right.
So we then have our own housing crisis.
Right, and that's why that highway between Tracy and Livermore and the Bay is, up until COVID anyway, was full every day.
Was full every day, which is why I authorized something called Valley Link a couple of years ago that should be able to let ACE train connect right over that Altamada with the BART.
But you're right, it is a bedroom community, it's industry, it's commerce, it's an urban area. And I know you, serving as a city council member in Stockton, you dealt with a lot of the challenges that particularly that city dealt with, growing pains, fiscal and otherwise, as the new century began.
I did. I ran for Stockton City Council in 2006. I came in like any social worker, I was doing poverty programs, I was doing literacy programs, I was doing obesity programs, we were organizing around parks, doing everything good to build up the community. And then 2008 came along and the bottom fell out of the economy. And then we found ourselves cutting. And in 2012, earned the distinction of being the largest city in the nation to go into bankruptcy, which was an incredible, painful experience, but also very, I think, clarifying about public service, about knowing that you've got something bigger than yourself, bigger than your own career to think about, and you have to always put the needs of the whole above the needs of your own individual comfort level. If we had not gone into bankruptcy when we did, we would still be cutting. Stockton would not be on the recovery that we have found ourselves on, especially going into a pandemic.
I know you had led a valiant, but correct me if I'm wrong, so far mixed blessing effort to secure a higher education university site in Stockton, a CSU campus in particular, which would do so much for Stockton's potential to lift the social and economic life. Why has that not happened yet?
Well, just the yet is the operative word.
Well, you co-sponsored a bill in the Assembly, a $7 billion bond measure that would have, in theory, included funding, right?
Yeah,
for CSU Stockton?
we've come at this every way that we can think of so far and aren't done yet, I will say. Yeah, Stockton is the largest city in the state of California without a CSU. We are the largest area in the nation, the second largest area in the nation without one within 50 miles. In my district, we have 4 prisons, but not one public university. I think that says a lot about the state's priorities and values. So we have come at it with a study. We got $1 million for a study. We've done a bond measure. So anyway, we're coming at it different ways, and we are not done yet. We think that during this time of the pandemic, we've been able to see disparities. We know that our healthcare workforce is not up to par yet, so we think the Stockton area is a perfect place when you're going to put in a CSU, focus it on healthcare, focus it on technology, like a Cal Poly Stockton. As we have a port, we have agriculture. As we keep talking about this issue of resilience, climate resilience, farming resilience, I think a Cal Poly Stockton with the focus on resilience going forward into the next century is the perfect and the most cost-effective way we don't have the capacity right now in our public universities for all of our students, so let's build some more. We've got the money right now. It's a perfect time for investment.
We will focus on the yet when it comes to that. So you mentioned the impact of COVID on your communities, and of course we know that the pandemic has had a pernicious effect on those communities that were most vulnerable. And so as we begin to lift this truly dark veil of the coronavirus with vaccines in particular. There has been a landmark initiative underway here in California to take the vaccines to the fields and factories and focused on the workforces and the immigrants that are at high risk for COVID. Are you seeing that in the 5th District with your workers and them being a priority, finally?
It's never as fast as you want it, and it is never without glitches, especially when we're working through multiple levels of government. And I think listeners will agree, one of the things that we've learned, the disparities that we've seen with the pandemic have shown us disparities. I think they've also shown us sometimes the inefficiencies of large bureaucracies trying to turn on a dime, right? Trying to get the vaccines from the federal to the state to the county to the public health, and then the multiple ways it's coming in has made it more difficult to get it out. I think the administration has done a great job at trying to prioritize. We had a big clinic this weekend in Stockton, and there was still very long waits going on. But it is coming. It is coming, and both in Stanislaus County and San Joaquin County. I just got a report that we haven't had a mass vaccination site in Galt, so we're going to see if we can address that for the little sliver of Sacramento County,
right?
Sacramento,
yes.
I represent.
Well, considering as we talk about reaching out to immigrant communities and vaccinations or the struggles of farm workers, your tenacious fight to secure a CSU for Stockton, does it feel sometimes like the north end of the valley, your district and the cities and communities like Stockton and Ripon and Riverbank, do they get less focus in the world than, say, Fresno or Merced or Salinas? Do you feel that way?
I do feel that way. And I know people like, oh, stop crying about Stockton, but it does feel like the area has been more overlooked. I mean, again, we don't have a CSU, neither does Modesto, right? Another city of over 200,000, 250,000. But you have a UC in Merced, and then Fresno tends to be, it feels like to me, the middle of the valley. And so that's when people are like, we're going to the valley. They parachute in a lot of times to Fresno, and then we'll maybe fly back to Sacramento and miss all this upper region. We are densely populated, unlike other parts of the valley. We've got pretty density of population, huge diversity of population, and just great folks, right? And the wine, right? Like Napa always gets all this credit about the wine. That's
right. But
most of those grapes come from Lodi.
That's exactly right. And I think even people geographically don't understand. Sacramento was in the Central Valley.
Yes.
We look at Sacramento as Northern California, but in fact it's not. It's part of the Central Valley.
Yes.
So you have nurtured a diverse legislative portfolio in both the Assembly and now in the Senate. And one particular piece of legislation and law from the last decade, which has had a profound impact on California's collective body and soul, and for which your career and background as a mental health provider and a medical social worker has played such a prominent role in its success, and that was the End of Life Option Act, which was aiding the terminally ill who are mentally competent and who have 6 months or less to live, to give them the option to end their life. The bill became law in 2016, but it almost didn't make it. And I guess you could say it tore the scab off, maybe in a needed way, on the vexing debate here, even in liberal, open-minded California, about death and dying and mortality, and so many raw debates here in the Capitol in the middle of this past decade. Almost didn't make it into the law books and was vulnerable to court decisions and to the initiative process. You were deeply involved from the very beginning. Talk about the End of Life Option Act, the original one, its path to law, and the flaws and vulnerable points that you're trying to correct here 5 years later in the Senate.
Yes. So if I could back up just a little bit to say that I was a hospice social worker. Right. So I have worked in and around end of life for a large part of my professional career. I got my PhD in Portland in 1997. I began, and that is when the End of Life Option Act was going into effect there. So I was a part of that debate and did my graduate work at the End of Life facility up there, and I did my dissertation on end of life. And I have had probably, I don't know if you say fortunate, but I have had the experience of caring for a number of family members, close family members, as they have died. And
I think I've read your godmother and your father. Is that correct?
I've cared for my godmother in my 20s, my grandmother in my 30s, my mother in my 40s, and my father and my sister-in-law in my 50s.
Obviously, that gave you not just a sympathy and a sensitivity, but just a deep understanding of this process of death and the politics and the circumstances and the grief and the loss that surrounds it.
Absolutely. It is a complicated subject. I don't think anybody should step into, trying to work in this space lightly, and nobody does, right? Everybody comes, if you're a member voting, you come with your own experience of death. You come with your own reflections on people you have lost or people you fear losing, and sometimes that gets projected then onto your thinking about it. So yes, you're right, it almost didn't get passed. And I did a bill my very first year in office that I thought let me know how difficult something like this would be to pass. I thought I would work on this towards the end of my time in the legislature. I passed a bill that simply said, because currently the previous law had been, if you have a terminal illness from which no cure is expected, if you ask a physician, they would have to tell you what your options were. But if you never asked them, they never had to tell you. So we just trying to change the law to say the physician must tell you, right? You can continue with treatment, you can have no treatment, you can do hospice, because research shows us that oftentimes if people feel like the physician is above them, or if they don't have the same access to power and knowledge, they're not going to ask, right? They feel the doctor will tell me what I need to know. So just trying to flip that the other way so people would have more knowledge to be able to make decisions if they wanted to continue treatment, or perhaps they wanted to go to hospice. That was a huge bill, a huge fight to get that through. So I thought, we'll be quite a while before we can pass the End of Life Options Act. But it was that next year that Brittany Maynard, if you recall,
yes,
went up to Oregon and utilized their law, and it just started a whole new conversation. So it was Senator Wolk and Monning, who had also been working in this space for a long time, said we think the time is now. So we started that bill, started the process with them in the Senate and me in the Assembly at that time. And I would say most people will say that there had never been more tears or more conversations than that when we were trying to get that bill passed. We ended up not being successful. This is what you alluded to. We couldn't get the votes for it in one of the policy committees. But at the same time, a little bit later, that was when Governor Brown did a special session on health. Nothing in that special session precluded the introduction of this bill. We thought it fit. We introduced it. And council and everybody else has agreed that it was passed. It went through policy committees, it went through everything it still had to go through. And so ended up becoming law with, again, just with a lot of, on both sides, heartfelt, agonizing decisions, I think, for a lot of people.
I know that you are a practicing Catholic, and I had read that the Catholic Church came at you pretty hard on questioning your beliefs and your faith by authoring a bill like this. That must have been difficult, too.
Yeah, it is, right? But I am a Catholic in my faith, but I am a social worker, and I don't support the death penalty. So I'm good on 1 out of 3.
The tales are told here in the Capitol of a very meaningful, moving speech that you gave in one of the, I think it was in session, that essentially wrapped the ribbon around the passage of this bill, talking about your father, talking about actually the joy of dying. You have said that there's actually a lot of joy in end-of-life work and in the end-of-life process, and that really is what cinched it for so many people that might have been on the fence. It may sound counterintuitive to some people, the joy of the end-of-life process.
As a hospice social worker, going into a home where somebody is dying, it's time to get to work, right? I mean, whatever issues you want to deal with in life, whatever things you wanted to work out, it's go time. So to be able to enter that process, I think, with a family was so rewarding. And everybody dies, right? So just the diversity of people that you get to deal with is huge and vast. And at the end of all our lives, we want to know that our lives mattered, that people will remember us. And some people want to be in charge right up to the last minute on how they want people to remember them. There was one woman I'll never forget. She came to testify that she was a single mom. She had raised her young daughter with everything she had. Her daughter was 21. She knew she was going to die, and she wanted to give her little girl that last gift of being able to die a gentle death. And so I just think it's that sacredness that we bring to the process, understanding that everybody's path is their own, that everybody's journey is their own, and how they want to be remembered can sometimes be defined as part of their death.
That's beautiful. Why are we as a society, a culture, a species, so afraid to die and to acknowledge death? Even the most spiritual of us still, up at least until a certain point, feel that fear of dying.
It's human nature. I just think it's part of, even when you think about manifest destiny, right? What kind of creature thinks they can take over a world or build bridges or fly to the moon, right? It is us with our unending optimism that says we can do everything, we can do anything. And when you come to the end where you're not able to, like, oh, I'm not going to be able to beat this, right? I mean, a lot of things that it feels like in our life we have set up as competitions if we can beat it or if we can overcome it. And you can't with death, right? I mean, you might a couple times, but at some point, there is an end to everything, right? Like, I mean, go back to bread. For everything, there is a season.
Absolutely.
For everything, there is a season. And I just think that's hard for us as humans to accept. And for many people, the more they talk about it or think about it or acknowledge the existence, it means that they are closer. And not only they are closer, but their loved ones are closer.
Maybe a reading of Ecclesiastes would be very helpful for those of us who are facing that situation and also those of us who have family members that are too. Well, let me back you up a little bit on the 2021 legislation. Okay. Current law, the current End-of-Life Option Act, some people are saying has too many obstacles, probably as a result of a heavy lot of amendments and negotiations and understanding at the passage of the last bill. The mandatory 15-day waiting period for the aid in dying is not long enough, or some people can't make a decision or even know about it before this 15-day period. Get the right practitioners medically to help them out. It also is set to sunset in 2025. So you want to fill in the blanks, correct the errors, if you will, and make it permanent. So tell us a little bit more about, I guess it's SB 380.
Yeah, one of the things when we passed the bill was I committed that we would do, and there is part of the bill, is that there's a feedback loop to the legislature every year. There's data collected, goes to the Department of Health, the Department of Public Health. So the data is collected. So we said we look at that every year. I've held a hearing. And every time we hold a hearing and we look at the data and we hear from people who have tried to use the bill, mostly family members at that point, we have heard and identified issues. These are some of the biggest ones that we've identified. Sometimes people will say, when I get to that point, I want to use it. Physician might say, okay. When the person gets to that point and they say, okay, let's start the process, then they might hear from the physician, oh, sorry, I don't do that. Again, people get the idea that somebody gets a diagnosis of terminal illness of some kind, and they're like, oh, I'm going to go and get that pill to kill myself. That is not how it works. People bargain. People do all kinds of things. For the most part, people have engaged in years of treatment before they have decided, I think I have used up all my options. I'd like to use this last option, the End-of-Life Option Act. So some people say, oh, that might just be having a bad day. Well, they are somebody with a terminal illness from which no cure is expected, who, for the most part, and I think this is probably 100%, have tried some kind of curative treatment before they decide to do that. So once they get to that point, finding somebody and then finding that second person, that 15 days can shrink very quickly. And if you have something like MS, because you also have to be able to self-ingest, you may not be able to swallow anymore. You may not be able to put your hand to your mouth anymore, the things that would be necessary for you to do in order to complete the process.
Mm-hmm. And your desire to make this permanent is so that you don't have to revisit.
So we don't have to revisit it. It just does not seem fair to take something away from people, a right away from people, after they've already had that right.
Do you expect to engage the same forces, pro and con, and revisit the emotional, existential debates on this as you did back in 2014 and 2015?
There are some who will still engage in the debate, but some of the bigger debates were the scare tactics of they're going to kill children, they're just going to try to kill old people or people of color or poor people or disabled people. There is no data anywhere in the world that supports that. So I think we have been able to say, no, this is not used for that. It was used by a pretty small group of folks. And a lot of people who get the prescription don't even use it. It's knowing that it's there. That's the peace of mind that it gives them, just to be able to say, well, if it gets this bad or this bad, I might use it. But a lot of people die without even using it. But it's that peace of mind that is there for the patient and sometimes their family.
And in fact, the End-of-Life Option Act has been, if you'll pardon the expression, a success from what I understand, since in the, 3.5 years of the bill's existence, that nearly, maybe a little bit longer, nearly 2,000 Californians have accessed its rights and permissions.
I heard from somebody over the weekend. They were getting ready to lose somebody, and if the person didn't go, he'd laid out a timeline for himself that they would then exercise the act, and in fact did so. Everybody was grateful and prepared, and the family had a beautiful time together at the very end.
The issues of death and grief, we can't help but be reminded when we talk about them of this past pandemic year. More than 500,000 Americans are dead from COVID. And even if we don't know somebody who has COVID, and more than likely we do, or somebody who died from it, we still have to face the loss of a world that used to exist but might not be the same going forward. We feel tired, we feel wired, but we are only now, here in the early part of 2021, perhaps finding the moment and the space to stop and feel the grief that comes from the tragedy of this. So as a hospice worker, as a medical practitioner, as a state leader, for our collective mental health, how do we move forward from this? This is not something a vaccine can cure.
I think we need to have some patience with ourselves. I think going back to work, going back into closer contact with people, it's going to feel good, and it's going to take some adjusting. So I think people need to be patient with themselves and try to take it at a pace and provide yourself some time for reflection as well. I find myself, as somebody who used to be busy every evening and every weekend out at some community event, now there's not community events, right? So, and then you think, oh, now I'm going to start going back. So I just say, give yourself some time, some space, and then appreciate the gifts, right? Because there were gifts during this pandemic too. It may have been spending more time with family. It may have been bread. It may have been a new hobby, or just being more okay spending some time alone. Don't forget those gifts that you've learned and take them forward with you.
Even the notion of negotiating with someone else for a space in the line at the grocery store is something we haven't had a lot of chance to do. And so even those kind of just small human interactions are going to take some getting used to again.
They will. And I think, and we've all learned to look at each other's eyes more, right? To read people's faces in different kinds of ways.
That's right. But you got to admit, you miss smiles, right?
I do.
You miss, facial
smiles.
expressions, yes. Here's an interesting notion, too, on this subject, which allows me to awkwardly transition to a final topic here. Believe it or not, from what I have read, the pandemic and time of isolation has been considered a freedom for some people, freedom from social pressures, from the expectation of others. And I've read some stories, interestingly enough, that the gift of time and freedom has allowed some members of the LGBTQ community across the country, particularly those who have recently come out or transitioned, to fully emerge as themselves without having to justify to others in the now, in the moment, about what that self should be. That it's given those in the community some space to shore up who they are, how they identify, without this gaze or judgment of others identifying it for them. From those in the community that perhaps you have talked to and that you have been a part of for most of your life, self-identified, does that sound authentic?
I think so. As you're talking about it, yeah, no, I think so. I think we're all like kind of re-emerging as, I won't say as new characters, but this is kind of a time of redefinition of ourselves as we come back out, right? Whether people have lost weight or gained weight, or they've changed their hairstyle, whatever. But sometimes just who we are as people, like you said, people aren't used to seeing you every day and thinking about you in a certain way. You get to a little bit redefine who you are as you're coming out, as we're all coming out. It is a true process. Yeah.
There have been, in fact, some breakthrough moments for the LGBTQ community in government and leadership positions across the country. A recent census that I had read, and you have actually responded to, of LGBTQ elected officials across the country showed an 88% increase in their elective presence and power since 2017, especially in local and statewide offices. Of course, we have Pete Buttigieg, who is now the transportation secretary under Joe Biden, and then Dr. Rachel Levine, who recently became the first transgender person confirmed by the Senate. This is extraordinary.
It is.
What message does it send to aspiring leaders of the community, but I think more importantly to the rest of the world watching?
Right. No, I think it says there are no barriers. Be who you are. If you are fully your authentic self, you have a much better chance of more fully serving. Right? If you're too busy trying to hide who you are or put on some kind of show, you can never be the public servant that elected life asks you to be. So be your full self, and you'll be the best elected leader you can be.
So as we talk about a lot of the challenges, the sobering elements of life here, circa 2021, there is also hope.
There's also hope. I'll never forget, I've got a picture that pops up every once in a while when the Supreme Court made the decision. I was up on the Capitol steps with Ricardo Lara, right, who is, one of my close friends and is now the insurance commissioner. I mean, we just keep shining lights and making progress, and it feels like the America that should be.
Thank you for shining your light. This has been a delightful conversation, everything from bread to legislation to the elements of life and death. I really appreciate your time. Keep on baking the bread and connecting folks with each other. And thank you very much, Senator Talamantes Eggman, for being with us here on Then There's California.
Thank you very much.
And that brings us to a close of this edition of Then There's California. We're a production of the California State Senate Democratic Caucus, with technical assistance and production support from Martin Ashley, Bob Rolte, Brian Shadden, Rainier Sabiniano, Gunjan Patel, John Roman, McClena Woods, Lisa Murphy, Ricardo Sainz Ione, and the graphic artistry of Tim Davis. On behalf of State Senator Susan Eggman, representing Stockton and the 5th Senate District, I'm Brian Green at the State Capitol in Sacramento. Thanks for listening to Then There's California.